Hey guys, welcome to CTD tier list because a new update dropped and I wanted to help out people who are just starting or progressing through. Unlike all other tier list creators, I actually did you guys a favor and pre organized the list. So if you don't want the details, you can just see it all right now. I do recommend watching the explanations if you want a better understanding of what the towers do and the reasoning behind the placements, though. Within each tier, towers are in no particular order, and it's organized from A through F, with C and above being passing, just like grades. Okay, we'll start with minor. Minor is the best eco tower bar none, the best tower bar none. It's consistent income without gimmicks, really cheap to place and upgrade, so you can balance investing your money into eco and defense, which ends up making you a lot of money in the long run, incrementally. On paper, it doesn't make quite as much money as Thief or Farmer, but it's just more practical. If this list had an S tier, this would definitely be alone in it. Just too good. Programmer. Programmer is an incredible support. It's good for all difficulties, solo and group. Just 25% passive buff with a huge range and an active for burst damage is just too good. You only need 3 max programmers or 4 level 3 ones to chain the buff permanently. So, yeah, it's just really good, mathematically speaking. Mercenary. Merc is an excellent hybrid, early mid defense and mid late support. It shines in low difficulties in general and in a group for high difficulties. Maxed out, they're hyper efficient and strong because they can attack independently with decent DPS, and they can also buff 25% with a huge range. They're pretty cheap, they get early HD, they're pretty efficient at level 3 too, so they're a decent early mid defense. Main issue with them is that they rely on the ability to be efficient and powerful at high levels. So you need to be able to affect multiple towers with it and you actually use it properly. And the ability is very difficult to chain permanently because it's so short duration. You need 6 max mercs and constant attention, which can be expensive. It strains your tower limit, and it's just difficult to focus while doing it on doing other stuff like moving your towers, using other abilities, etc. Up next is Cyborg, which is the king of late game DPS. At max, he just offers incredible single target, and he's good against spam too. Um, Level 4 is pretty cheap and efficient, so you can use them in the mid game. He has hidden detection, doesn't take an obnoxious amount of space, and he's pretty flexible. So you can pair him with the sub DPS or with Priest. He can be a sub DPS if you have a placement unlimited main like Sniper or Blaster. In the early game, he's worthless, but I mean, you don't use him for the early game. The main issue with him is his placement limit of 3, which does hold him back in insane late games. You need to usually partner him with sub DPS, priest, or a hybrid support like mercenary to get his full potential. You can't just bring this guy in early game and supports. Don't get me wrong though, 3 of these guys is still nutty in itself. It's just not as good as 40 snipers or something like that. Next is Prophet, best bossing tower. Uh, it's impractical and not very flexible, which holds it back. The single target damage is the best bar none. It has great range, works really well with Priest, but it's stupidly expensive, so much that you won't be able to afford it without gimmicky thief shenanigans, all of them maxed by the end. And he doesn't have hidden detection without Priest helping. Against anything that's not bosses, he's absolutely useless because he needs to wind up. And he does have a spell placement limit, although this doesn't really come into play because the game ends before you max all of them. B tier. Sniper. On good sniper maps, he's capable of the best cumulative damage because he has huge range and you can place as many as you want. He ignores armor and it's cost efficient, so it's good in the late game of Insane. He killed the sorcerer in shield phase and other high defense enemies like shielders and stuff. The middle upgrades are kind of usable in the mid game as well. Individually, though, they're weak, and only a handful of maps are actually good for them because most of them don't have well positioned cliff space to allow to put a lot of them. And it's excellent under good conditions, but not always good, so B tier. Blaster is the best mid to late game DPS tower besides Cyborg for low difficulties, and it's unfortunately mediocre on high difficulties. It's super simple. It's just, solid DPS, above average range, unlimited placement. Hidden detection is cheap, and he is cheap, so you can use him in the mid game. And he shoots fast enough to handle spam and single targets, but at the end of the day, he just doesn't hit hard enough, and you have to micromanage him to deal damage, and it takes a ridiculous amount of money and space to do that. In Insane, the late game enemies will just like overwhelm it. Hunter. Hunter's a pretty good support. He mainly offers his 20% range buff, which is really good for late game DPS and support towers. He's okay as an early defense because he's cheap. Not great though. And his buff has a small radius and can only buff a handful of towers. So he doesn't really work with towers that take a lot of space like blasters. You probably need more than one hunter to buff everything you need, and the final upgrade costs quite a bit considering he doesn't do anything late game besides offer the buff. B tier. Recon. Recon is the best early to mid game tower for all difficulties, but it falls off really hard. With minors and skips, you can get it fast. The first two upgrades are cheap, efficient, and give detection early. He deals good single target and splash, so he's pretty versatile. However, in the late game, he's just worthless. He has no range, no utility. Once a boss passes him, you have to sell it and put it again. Just not worth it. Phantom. Phantom's the best starter tower and good on bosses as well. In the opening waves, he can clear him alone, and he gets cheap detection. He also has good boss damage and utility at level 4 or higher because his range is global. But in the mid game, he's just useless because he gets overwhelmed and killed by anything with over 15 HP. And some maps restrict phantom placement on parts of the path, which does make it weaker in the late game, but it's not a common thing. Only a handful do it. B tier. Toxicator. Tox is an excellent crowd control and sub DPS, but as a main, it's pretty unreliable. He has the best area damage in the game. He's pretty good at single target too. Great range. He's expensive, but he's definitely worth what you pay. What holds it back as a main DPS is that his poison doesn't stack, so if you place a bunch of them, you get diminishing returns. He also doesn't have hidden detection. As a sub DPS, Toxicator is pretty nutty on dual lanes where splash damage really matters, but on single lanes, Cyborg or support tower is probably just a better use of the tower slot and your money. C tier. Soul Master. Soul is a context-specific crowd control. It's cheap enough to be used as a starter and can handle spam at all stages of the game if placed properly. He has level 0 hidden detection, super good. And his late game summons do some single target damage if they do stack up. The main issue with him is that he can only function on bends and corners of the right size and shape Otherwise, he's entirely, utterly useless, which is a lot of the time. He's just useless. C tier. Juggernaut. Jug is mid to late game crowd control. He does good area damage without being too expensive. At the end of the day, though, he's strong but one dimensional and dumb. Doesn't offer too much. And his slow attack speed and short range causes him to miss fast enemies. He has no detection. He does nothing against the boss. C tier. Priest. Priest is a situational late game support tower that mostly succeeds by riding on the coattails of Cyborg and Prophet. Max Priest offers godly value and damage when attached to either of those two, but it's worthless attached to anything else because he only affects one at a time. And he's pretty darn expensive as well. There's also a limit of one Max Priest per player, and the other upgrades are just garbage when you compare them to Programmer, Mercenary, or just putting more towers. The ability is nice, but not a huge difference maker. C tier. Infernus. Infernus is an auxiliary support tower that isn't that important to bring, but it does help if you can afford to bring him. 25% slow, which works on bosses, and it does a good job of applying and maintaining the slow to multiple enemies while in the range. However, the slow doesn't really last that long outside the range, so you need to micromanage this guy on the boss. He's also expensive and does almost no damage. C tier. Farmer. Farmer is a situational economy tower mainly for solos. On paper, he's actually more efficient and earns higher bulk of money than miners in a vacuum, but he's held back due to his slow money gain. In solos, where you're in full control and you can just stall the waves to your heart's content and never skip and get every paycheck, he's really good. But this just can't happen in a group game. It's not that practical. It pigeonholes you into playing a certain way, and yeah, really just sucks. He also costs a lot to place and upgrade, so you can't use him early game or balance your economy and defenses precisely. Yeah, so because of the principles I discussed, basically minor is better for anything but solo. Snowman. Snowman's fairly niche support tower. He brings enemies to a dead stop, so the short range ones can free hit. Multiple of them do actually work together to stall the same enemy, but it doesn't work against bosses. It does no damage, so you're better off with the other supports. Thief. Thief is a gimmicky, high risk, high reward economy tower. If deployed in ideal conditions, he does make the most of any economy tower by far, like crazy money. It's practically infinite once they get rolling. He also does some damage. However, at the end of the day, he's too weak, inconsistent, and expensive at the outset to use in the early game as a solo or on any difficulty besides Insane in general. Even in Insane, he has to either be used alongside Miner or in a gimmicky funnel strategy where all your teammates sacrifice to let you use Thieves. And in either case, it's just worse than using Miner alone. If you use it with Miner, you waste a tower slot that could be used for something better. If you use Thief by itself, then the profit that you gain is offset by the opportunity costs your teammates lose by babysitting you the whole game. And if more than one person uses it, the entire game just crashes and burns. So yeah, if it didn't sound bad enough already, Thief also steals space from other DPS towers potentially. Just not so good. Gunner. Gunner is decent but outclassed, usually for lower difficulties. It's cheap and his early upgrades are fairly efficient. He attacks fast enough to deal with single targets or spam. He has mid-game relevance on normal difficulty if you put a lot of them, but on higher difficulties, he's just pure trash. His later upgrades cost a lot but do basically nothing. Bomber. Bomber is a decent but outclassed early to mid-game tower, has affordable placement, and can handle spam or single threats. and it's respectably efficient, but it's still expensive to upgrade and it doesn't really hit that hard, so not really worth using. Spearman. Spearman is a situational and slightly flawed early to mid game tower for lower difficulties. He's affordable and efficient against spam or single threats. His hidden detection just is far too expensive though, because he only gets it at max, and he can only function well with specific placements, which may be limited because he has a certain ring that he has hidden to work. Grenadier. Grenadier is an outclassed early game tower. He's cheap and decent against spam, but in the end game or against single targets, he's useless. D tier. Warrior. Warrior is an outclassed early game tower. He's good for the first few waves, but his later upgrades are stupidly expensive but utterly garbage, so he's useless past that. Warrior is only decent if placed on corners too, so most maps don't have enough to really make use of him. Archer. Uh, Archer is a trash can tower, few redeeming qualities. It has good range, but nothing else. You have to spam them because they're individually weak, but you take up limited cliff space with them. Really disappointing. Scout. Last but not least, it's the worst tower in the game and has no redeeming qualities. Never use this period unless you have only this in Archer and you ran out of cliff space for Archer. Just F tier. This tower is offensively bad. Just disgusting. Thanks for listening to the end. If you guys like the tier list or want to see any more in-depth content for CTD, just feel free to drop a comment below requesting what you want, and like or subscribe if you want to. Thank you.